The transport doors hissed open, and a stench of iron and smoke spilled into the governor's chamber. Guards shoved a man forward, his wrists bound in alien-forged shackles that glowed faintly blue. He stumbled, but didn't fall, his back straight despite the weight of chains. Blood streaked across his jaw, dried from earlier beatings, but his eyes burned with something the governor had not seen in a very long time: unyielding defiance. Governor Celera stood tall at the center of the chamber, her uniform cut sharp and severe, the insignia of alien rule shimmering across her breastplate. The room itself was designed to intimidate. High ceilings carved with alien glyphs, cold white lights spilling down, shadows stretching along the polished stone floor. Every prisoner who entered here bowed, broke, or begged. It was the way of things. But this one, this human, he only stared at her as though daring her to blink first. The guard shoved him to his knees. He did not kneel willingly. His legs buckled only because the blow from behind forced him down. Even then, he twisted his shoulders, adjusting until his posture looked more like a soldier braced for battle than a slave awaiting judgment. Governor Celera, one of the guards intoned, his alien accent flattening the words, "This is the one. The human soldier captured in the Western skirmish. He killed 3 of ours before he was subdued. The High Council decrees he be given to you, for discipline, for display." Celera's gaze flicked from a soldier to the guards. She dismissed them with a curt gesture. The chamber doors sealed, leaving only her and the prisoner. Silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating. She circled him slowly, her boots striking sharp against the stone. He tracked her with his eyes, but kept his chin lifted. A dangerous thing, that pride. Dangerous and compelling. "You stand in my chamber," she said at last, her voice crisp, measured without warmth. "Do you know what that means?" His lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Means you think you own me." The words cracked through the air like a whip. No prisoner had ever dared. Celera stopped behind him, staring at the rigid line of his spine. For a moment, the familiar script of her authority failed her. She should have struck him, corrected him, made an example. Yet the words caught in her throat. "You misunderstand," she said, though her tone carried less bite than intended. "You are not mine. You are theirs. I am merely the hand that holds the chain." At that, he finally bowed his head, not in submission, but in something colder, contempt. Chains are chains. Doesn't matter whose hand holds them. Celera's fingers tightened around the real chains in her grip, the iron links that tethered him to her. She had overseen countless prisoners. She had broken leaders, rebels, men and women who swore they would never yield. They all did eventually. The system was flawless. Yet here he was, bleeding, bound, humiliated, still daring to speak as though he stood on equal ground. "What is your name?" she demanded. He looked up, eyes gleaming. "Doesn't matter." She stepped closer, towering over him. "It matters to me." A beat of silence stretched. His jaw clenched, then finally, "Kieran." Celera repeated it under her breath, tasting the syllables. Human names were often blunt, unadorned, but this one felt sharp as a blade. She moved to stand before him, forcing him to tilt his head back to meet her gaze. His eyes didn't flinch, didn't soften. They burned as though her presence itself was an insult. "You will serve me now," she said. "Not as a soldier, but as property. You will clean, carry, obey. And if you refuse—" "I've already refused," Kieran cut in. The audacity struck her like a physical blow. No prisoner interrupted her. No one dared. Heat flared in her chest. Anger, yes, but tangled with something more dangerous. Something she didn't want to name. She leaned closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his irises. "You will call me governor," she said, her voice dropping into a whisper edged with steel. Kieran's lips parted, as though he might say the word. Instead, he breathed out, "Never." Silence again, thicker than before. Celera straightened, her grip on the chain tightening until her knuckles whitened. She should have ordered his tongue cut out. She should have summoned the guards and had him dragged away for re-education. But her body betrayed her. She did none of those things. She only stood, watching him as though trying to decipher a riddle carved into stone. For the first time in years, Celera felt the crown of her authority wobble, just slightly, as though it didn't sit as securely as she thought. "You will learn," she said finally, though her voice lacked its usual edge. "They all do." Kieran tilted his head, eyes blazing with the same fire that had carried him through battle, through capture, through humiliation. "Then maybe I'm not like the others." The words burrowed into her, dangerous seeds taking root in soil she thought long barren. Celera turned away sharply, striding back to her throne at the chamber's far end. But even as she sat, chains coiled neatly in her lap, she felt his gaze burn into her, stripping away the cold armor she had so carefully forged. He was her prisoner now, her property. Yet somehow, with every breath, she felt less like his master and more like the one under watch. And deep inside, though she would never admit it aloud, a whisper stirred in the cracks of her mind. What if he never breaks? The chains rattled softly as Celera dismissed the guards and kept the human in her quarters instead of the barracks where the rest of the slaves were held. It was not protocol. She knew it, the guards knew it, and perhaps even Kieran knew it, but she justified it to herself with the excuse of discipline. He was dangerous, she told herself. He needed closer oversight. That was the reason. Yet even as she told herself this, she knew it was only half the truth. Kieran moved with a deliberate slowness as he scrubbed the polished stone floor, each motion steady, silent, unhurried. He wasn't cowed. He wasn't even pretending. His back was straight, his head unbowed, even when his hands were raw against the rough bristles of the brush. Most servants rushed, desperate to finish their task before her sharp eyes noticed flaws. He, however, worked as though the room belonged to him, as though she were merely an observer. Celera sat at her desk, reading the reports from the alien overseers above her rank, but her gaze kept slipping. Again and again, she found herself watching him instead of the glowing glyphs on the page. "You missed a spot," she said coldly, pointing to a patch of stone. He didn't look up. "Then you can clean it." The words should have enraged her. They should have sparked the discipline she'd been trained to deliver without hesitation. But instead, something twisted in her chest. The corner of her mouth almost curved before she stopped it. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You forget yourself," she said, striding toward him, her boots echoing like hammers. "You are mine to command." Finally, he looked up at her. His eyes met hers, steady, sharp, unafraid. "Then command all you like. I'll never call you mistress." The words cracked the air between them like a whip. For a heartbeat, Celera felt the armor of her authority slip. She should have struck him. She should have made an example. Instead, she froze, staring down at him as though the simple refusal had turned the chamber upside down. "Do you enjoy provoking me?" she asked, her voice low. "I enjoy being myself," Kieran said simply. That unsettled her. She straightened, forcing herself to step back. "You will learn obedience. Every human does. Or maybe," he said, returning to his scrubbing, "every human pretends. You just don't see it." The words dug deep, sharper than any blade. She turned away before he could see the crack in her composure. That night, when the chamber was empty and quiet, Celera sat alone in her quarters. The chains lay coiled on the table, gleaming in the pale light. Her reflection in the polished surface looked more like a mask than a face. Hard eyes, stiff posture, the perfect governor. Yet her thoughts circled endlessly around the man who had dared to speak as though she wasn't his master, as though the chains were illusions. She had been raised to believe power was absolute, that humans existed in two categories: those who ruled on behalf of the aliens, and those who obeyed. She had been elevated from her people for her loyalty, her strength, her willingness to enforce the rules. But now she wondered, was her crown nothing more than another shackle? She served the aliens as much as he resisted them. Celera's hand drifted to the chains, her fingers brushing the cold links. She hated that they suddenly felt heavier than they had the day before. She hated that his words followed her into her sleep, echoing in her dreams like distant thunder. The next morning, She ordered him to stand at attention while she reviewed reports. His chains dragged across the floor as he moved, but when he stood before her, he looked more like a soldier awaiting orders than a slave. "Say it," she demanded. "Say the word." He tilted his head. "Mistress." "No," she snapped. "Governor." He smirked faintly. "I told you before. Never." The defiance should have sparked punishment. Instead, it sparked something else, something dangerous. It stirred a heat inside her, a reminder that she was not as untouchable as she pretended. "Why resist?" she pressed. "Why not yield and save yourself the pain?" Kieran's voice was steady, quiet, but unshaken. "Because the moment I bow, I stop being me, and then you win." Solara's throat tightened. For the first time, she realized his defiance wasn't just stubbornness. It was survival. He clung to it like breath itself. And in that truth, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Because if his resistance was survival, then what was her obedience? That night, alone again, Solara stood before the mirror, her crown resting heavy on her brow. She saw not a ruler, but a puppet with strings made of duty and fear. She remembered Kieran's words. Chains are chains, no matter who holds them. She touched the crown, slid it off, and for one fleeting moment felt lighter. But only for a moment. The weight of her role settled back on her shoulders the instant she set it down. And somewhere in the silence, she admitted the truth she could never say aloud. When she looked at Kieran, she didn't see a slave. She saw a man. And every day as fire burned, it lit the cracks in her crown brighter. "Do you want me to keep this same ton?" The night was thick with silence, the kind that pressed against walls and sank in a bone. The alien city slept under the cold hum of watchtowers and patrols, their lights sweeping over empty streets like unblinking eyes. Inside her chambers, Solara sat rigid at the edge of her bed, her crown discarded on the table beside her. The chains of her authority coiled neatly beside it. She had dismissed her guards hours ago. She had tried to read, to drink, to meditate, anything to silence the storm inside her, but nothing worked. Her thoughts kept circling back to him. Kieran. He was supposed to be asleep in the corner where the slaves rested, chained to the wall. And yet she could hear him breathing even through the quiet, steady and unyielding, as if his lungs had never learned submission. She hated that she had memorized the rhythm of it, hated that she had begun to crave its reassurance. She stood abruptly, her bare feet soundless against the polished floor. The governor, the cold face of alien order, had no business pacing her chambers like a restless girl. But she couldn't help herself. She glanced toward the shadows where he lay, the chain glinting faintly in the dim light. "You're awake," she said, though she hadn't checked. His voice came steady from the dark. "And you can't sleep." Her jaw tightened. Even in chains, he had a way of seeing straight through her armor. "You presume too much. I only speak what's true." She should have snapped at him, should have reminded him of his place. But the words wouldn't form. Instead, she found herself walking closer. Each step felt like a betrayal of the distance she was supposed to keep. When her eyes adjusted, she saw him, sitting upright against the wall, his chain slack at his wrist. His face was shadowed, but his eyes caught the light, sharp and burning. "Why do you stare at me like that?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Because you're not what you pretend to be." Her breath hitched. It was absurd. He was a prisoner, she the ruler, but his words cut deeper than anything the alien overlord had ever said. "And what do I pretend to be?" "A master," he said simply. "But every time you look at me, you look like you're searching for something you lost." Something inside her cracked. She hated how true it felt, how naked she suddenly was beneath his gaze. She should have turned away. Instead, she reached out, hesitant, trembling, and touched his face, just the edge of her fingers brushing the line of his jaw. His body went still. For a moment, she thought he would shove her hand away or spit words of defiance. But he didn't. He only stared at her with a sharpness that made her feel raw, stripped of her crown, her rank, her armor. "I shouldn't," she whispered. "Then don't," he said. But she couldn't pull her hand back. Her thumb traced the edge of his cheek, rough with days of stubble. She hadn't touched a man this way in years, maybe ever. Not as governor, not as someone with power, but as a woman aching with loneliness. Kieran's chest rose, a deep inhale, steadying himself. "Why are you doing this?" She swallowed hard. "Because I'm tired of being a mask." His eyes softened, but his voice stayed low. "I am not yours to claim." That should have stopped her. It should have reminded her of the chains between them, of the gulf carved by the aliens. But instead, it drew her closer. And yet, she whispered, her face near his, "I cannot stop." She leaned in before he could refuse again, her lips brushing his. For a heartbeat, he resisted, tense, unmoving, the chains clinking faintly as if reminding him of his place. But then something shifted. His hand, shackled though it was, rose and pulled her closer, his mouth answering hers with a force that shattered the stillness. The kiss was not gentle. It was fire, defiance, hunger, need, all crashing together. The chains between them clattered softly, not as symbols of power now, but as sparks struck against stone, each rattle feeding the heat. She felt herself breaking apart. Celera the governor, Celera the symbol of alien authority, Celera the untouchable mask, falling away until only a woman remained. And in his arms, for the first time in years, she felt human again. When they pulled apart, her breath was unsteady, her forehead resting against his. "This changes nothing," she whispered, though her voice trembled with a lie. Kieran's lips curved faintly, not mocking, not cruel, but certain. "It changes everything." She closed her eyes, the truth burning in her chest. The chains lay heavy between them, but for the first time, they didn't feel unbreakable. The revelation came not with shouts or banners, but with silence that slithered into Solara's chamber like poison. She had grown used to the hush of the alien patrols outside, the ritual of dismissing her guards before retreating to her private chambers, the forbidden rhythm of her eyes straying toward the man chained at the corner of her room. But this silence was different, too heavy, too deliberate. It was the silence of watchers who already knew. Kieran sensed it first. Shackled, bruised, his body still bearing marks of defiance. He lifted his head when the door slid open without announcement. Alien soldiers poured in, their armor gleaming with the cold, insectal sheen of their masters. Behind them, the overseer stepped through, a figure tall and skeletal, its eyes glowing with cruel satisfaction. "Governor Celera," the overseer hissed, his voice like steel dragged across stone. "You disappoint." Her blood ran cold. Still, she forced herself upright, lifting her chin with practiced authority. "You enter my chambers without summons? You forget yourself." But the overseer only smiled, if the pulling back of his lipless maw could be called a smile. He gestured with a clawed hand, and two guards yanked Kieran forward by his chain. The human stumbled but did not fall. His defiance was a flame that no amount of bruises had smothered. The overseer's gaze slid between them. "You dare touch what is forbidden. You dare forget your place." Solara's mask faltered. For a moment, her carefully cultivated authority, built on alien approval, on human fear, cracked. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny, but one glance at Kieran sealed the lie in her throat. His lips were bloodied, his chest bruised, yet his eyes burned steady on hers. He would not deny what they had shared, and in his silence, the truth was clear. The punishment was swift. They beat him first, not with mercy, not with the efficiency of discipline, but with deliberate cruelty meant to break both body and spirit. The sound of each strike echoed in the chamber, rattling the chains that bound him. Celera tried to stand tall, to remain the governor, but with each blow, she flinched, her fists clenching at her sides. "Stop this," she commanded, her voice sharp, brittle. But the overseer only turned his gaze to her. "You command nothing." Two guards stepped forward and tore the insignia from her uniform. The crown that had once marked her authority was plucked from the table and tossed carelessly to the floor, where it clattered like scrap metal. Celera froze, the sound piercing through her chest. That crown had once been her shield, her symbol, her proof that she was more than just another conquered human. And now, in the overseer's hand, it was nothing, Her body shook with rage, but her mind swam with something colder, clarity. She had never been free. The crown had not been power. It had been a leash gilded in false authority. They had raised her up only to remind her she could fall. As Kieran collapsed to his knees, his blood staining the floor, she realized the truth with searing finality. She had never owned him. She had never owned anything. The overseer's voice slithered again. This human has corrupted you. He will be broken, and you will learn obedience. But Kieran, broken as he was, lifted his head. Through split lips and bloodied teeth, he whispered, "She was never yours to command." The room stilled. For a heartbeat, the overseer's eyes narrowed, cold fire burning within them. Then, with a flick of his claw, he ordered the guards to drag Kieran away. Celera surged forward, instinct overriding fear. No! The word tore from her throat before she could stop it. She had begged for nothing in years, but the sound was raw, human, helpless. The overseer regarded her with a cruel tilt of his head. You forget. You are nothing without us. A crown upon a slave does not make her free. When the chamber emptied, when the echo of chains dragged Kieran out of sight, Celera collapsed to her knees before the discarded crown. Her reflection stared back at her in its polished surface. Not a ruler, not a master, but a woman hollowed out by lies. For the first time since the aliens had raised her above her people, she understood. Her crown had been a chain all along, and she had been a fool to wear it proudly. Her hands clenched around the cold metal until her knuckles turned white. She thought of Kieran, his defiance, his fire, the way he had kissed her as if she were not a governor but a woman. And for the first time, she envied him, because even broken, even chained, he was freer than she had ever been. The silence in the chamber deepened. It was no longer the silence of watchers, but of a mask shattered beyond repair. Celera lifted her head, her eyes burning not with tears, but with something new. Resolve. The crown clattered from her hand to the floor. She would not wear chains anymore. The night was heavy with the scent of smoke and blood. The ruins stretched before them like broken teeth against a sky that glowed faintly red from distant fires. She stumbled over the cracked stone, her once gleaming uniform in tatters, her arm pressed to her side where the wound still burned. He caught her before she fell, his hand steady even though his own body bore bruises and cuts from the punishments he had endured. The aliens hunted them still. Their shadows prowled the edges of the ruins, their machines humming faintly in the distance. But here among the collapsed arches and shattered walls, they were hidden, at least for a moment. She sank against the broken wall of what had once been a hall, her breath ragged. He crouched beside her, tearing strips from his own clothing to bind her wound. His hands were rough, scarred, but gentle as they pressed against her skin. She flinched at the pain, but her eyes lingered on him. Not the way a master stares at a slave, but the way a woman stares at the man who had risked everything for her. Her lips trembled, words building inside her like a dam threatening to burst. "You should leave me," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I'm the reason they hurt you, the reason you bleed." His head lifted, eyes fierce even in the dark. "And if I left you, what would that make me? The chains they gave you were never yours. I saw it at the first moment you looked at me." She turned her face away, shame filling her chest. The governor's crown had been stripped from her, her authority dissolved with a single command from her alien overlords. Everything she thought she had controlled was revealed as illusion. The chains in her hand had always been held by someone else, and yet she had clung to them, wielded them against him, because she had been too afraid to look at her own cage. Her hand trembled as she reached for him, fingers brushing his wrist where the marks of the restraints were still raw. "I never wanted to own you," she said, her voice breaking. "Do you understand? I told myself it was duty, that it was order. But the truth," her breath hitched, "the truth is I wanted you to see me. Not the crown, not the uniform, me." For a long moment, he said nothing. His silence was not rejection, but weight, as though her words hung in the air between them, demanding to be believed or discarded. His eyes, burning in the faint glow of the fires, softened as he reached to cup her cheek. then stop hiding behind chains. Her eyes flooded with tears, and she let herself collapse into his chest. He held her as if she had always belonged there, his heartbeat steady under her ear. She felt smaller than she had ever allowed herself to be, but in that smallness there was freedom. No crown, no orders, no alien shadow whispering what she must do. Just his arms, holding her without demand or fear. Outside, the night roared with distant thunder, the sound of alien war machines combing the ruins. They would be found eventually, hunted to the last breath. And yet, in that fragile moment, she felt something she had not known in years: peace. He shifted, adjusting her against the wall, then leaned close. "We'll move at dawn," he murmured. "I'll find food, water, a path through these ruins. They think they've broken us, but they don't understand. You're not their puppet anymore, and I am not their slave." His conviction lit something in her, a flame she thought had long died. She pressed her forehead to his, her hand clutching the fabric of his torn shirt. "If they catch us, they'll kill us both." "Then let them try," he whispered. "I would rather die free, with you in my arms, than live another day in their chains." Her lips parted, her breath shaky as she pressed them to his. The kiss was not born of power or desperation, but of confession, of two broken souls finding in each other the courage to stand. The ruins around them seemed to vanish. The fires of the colony faded. There was only the warmth of his mouth, the strength of his hands, and the quiet promise that for the first time, she was not alone. When they broke apart, she rested her head against his chest again, her voice barely audible. "In your arms, I feel human. Not a governor, not a traitor, just me. And that is all I ever wanted to see," he replied softly. The silence that followed was thick but no longer suffocating. It was the silence of shared breath, of two hearts beating in rhythm, of a fragile bond that had survived fire and cruelty and still endured. Above them, the stars peeked through the smoke, distant but watchful, as though even the heavens bore witness to this moment. Somewhere in the ruins, a machine whirred closer, its beam of light sweeping across broken stone. He tightened his hold on her, his body shifting instinctively to shield her. She felt no fear then. For the first time in her life, she did not measure herself by the chain she held or the authority she was given. She measured herself by the hand she now clutched, the man who stood beside her. The ruinous world around them still burned, but in the ashes, something fragile yet unyielding had been born. She knew their path would not be easy. They would be hunted, scarred, tested beyond breaking. But as he pulled her closer and whispered, "We will rise from this," she found herself believing him. And in that belief, she felt the weight of the crown fall away forever. The first time she saw it, she thought it was blood. His skin burned fever-hot beneath her hands as she helped him climb the shattered steps of the ruin. But then the glow began, threads of light crawling under his flesh like molten rivers. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest, a low growl torn from his throat. She recoiled at first, fear seizing her, but then the truth struck her. This wasn't blood. This was something the aliens had left inside him. "Don't touch me," he gasped, his voice strangled, as if each word cost him pain. "It spreads when I lose control." His hands trembled, veins shining like burning coals. But she could not step away. She sank beside him, her own hands hovering near his shoulders, aching to hold him but terrified she might be consumed. His body shook violently, the glow pulsing as if it wanted to tear him open. His teeth clenched, sweat dripping, his breath a ragged snarl. "They did this to you," she whispered, the realization heavy and sickening. "Experiments. You weren't just chained, you were changed." He laughed bitterly, though it was more of a choked cough. Their weapon, their pet project, their mistake. His body arched as another wave of light blazed through him, and she swore she saw fire flare from his skin before it sank back into him, like a star trying to break free. Her heart pounded. This wasn't just suffering, this was power. Volatile, destructive, deadly. And yet in his agony, he was fighting it, clinging to himself, refusing to let them win even in his blood. She reached out then, ignoring his warning, pressing her hand to his chest. The glow surged beneath her palm, heat biting into her skin, but she didn't pull away. "Look at me," she commanded, though her voice shook. His wild eyes snapped to hers, burning with terror and something worse, shame. "You are not their weapon," she said firmly. "Not while I'm here." He trembled, his breathing uneven. "I can't hold it." "Yes, you can," she whispered fiercely. Her fingers curled into his flesh, her forehead pressing against his. "You've been chained, beaten, remade in fire, but you are still you. Not theirs, not anyone's." The glow wavered, flaring, then flickered softer as his hands finally gripped her arms, grounding himself in her touch. His breath steadied against her cheek, his heartbeat slowing beneath her palm. The light receded slightly, no longer tearing him apart, but simmering under the surface, dangerous yet contained. Tears stung her eyes as she realized what had just happened. Her presence had anchored him. Her love had become the chain that bound him, not to slavery, but to himself. He was alive because of her, not despite her. For a long time, they stayed pressed together, his body quaking in the aftermath, her arms holding him tight as if she could keep him from unraveling. When at last he spoke, it was a whisper of wonder and grief. "Every time I thought I would break, they told me I was less than human, that I was nothing but fuel for their power. But with you, it doesn't burn me. It obeys." Her lips brushed his temple, her voice low but resolute. "Then let it burn for us, not for them." He drew back, looking at her with something fierce in his gaze now, something new. Not just survival, not just defiance. Purpose. His hands, still faintly glowing, cupped her face as though she were more fragile than glass. "You steady me. You make me more than what they built. And you," she whispered, her throat tight with emotion, "make me more than what they crowned." They kissed then, a desperate, consuming kiss that tasted of fire and ash and everything they had lost. Yet in that kiss, something greater ignited, a bond that fused not just bodies but rebellion itself. When dawn came, its pale light breaking through the smoke-filled sky, they moved again. He walked beside her, shoulders squared despite his exhaustion, the glow under his skin faint but pulsing steadily, like a heartbeat. She knew the danger wasn't gone. His body was still unstable, the fire threatening to consume him at any moment. But now it was no longer just a curse. Later that day, when alien scouts closed in, the fire returned. He felt it boiling up inside him, demanding release. His hands shook, his breath ragged, and she saw the terror in his eyes again, the fear of losing himself. But she reached for him, fingers lacing with his, and whispered, "With me." The world exploded. Light burst from his body in a shockwave, tearing through stone and steel, disintegrating the alien machines in an instant. Fire roared outward, brilliant and terrifying, but she felt none of its bite. Her hand remained in his, her body unscathed. When the blaze cleared, the ruins smoldered and silence reigned. Only the two of them stood, their shadows long against the broken ground. Her chest heaved as she looked at him, awe and fear colliding in her heart. He swayed, exhausted, the glow fading as he collapsed to his knees. She caught him, her arms tight around his trembling frame. He buried his face against her neck, his breath shuddering. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice raw. "No," she answered softly, stroking his hair. "You saved us." Word of what happened spread faster than fire. Survivors whispered of the slave who burned with alien flame and the governor who stood at his side. They said he was death to the oppressors, that her touch turned his curse into strength. For the first time, their story was no longer a secret in the shadows of ruins. It was a spark in the ashes, a beginning. As night fell, she sat with him in the quiet, her hand resting against the faint glow under his skin. He slept against her shoulder, worn to the bone, but even in sleep, he clung to her as though she were his anchor. She stared into the distance where alien towers pierced the sky, her jaw hardening. The fire in his flesh was no longer just survival. It was rebellion itself, and with her by his side, it was unstoppable. The colony had been silent for too long. Streets once filled with human voices had become graveyards of obedience, patrolled by alien enforcers and watched by steel towers that loomed like cages over the sky. But whispers move faster than chains can tighten. Whispers of a woman who had once worn the governor's crown, and the man who had once been forced to kneel before her. Whispers of fire in his flesh and rebellion in her heart. The whispers became voices, the voices became shouts, and the shouts turned into a tide. It began in the ruins where they hid. Survivors crept from shadows to see the truth for themselves. They came frightened, broken, starved, but when they saw the two of them standing side by side, the man glowing faintly with unstable fire and the woman stripped of her crown yet unbowed, something inside the colonists stirred awake. He did not tell them to rise. She did not order them to fight. They only looked at each other, hands clasped, a bond unbroken. And in that bond the people found the courage they had lost. "Chains don't hold us," one of the colonists whispered, staring at the shattered shackles lying at their feet. "Chains become banners." It spread like wildfire. Rusted chains lifted into the air, tied to poles, raised as symbols. Where once those iron links had dragged men and women into servitude, now they fluttered from rooftops like declarations of war. Across the colony, people began to tear down the alien sigils that hung above their doors, replacing them with chains knotted into shapes of defiance. The aliens responded with force. Enforcers in armor stormed into streets, ships circling above like vultures, and the towers glowed with the pulse of their surveillance. But rebellion is a sickness they cannot cure once it spreads to the heart. Men with no weapons hurled bricks at alien machines. Women set fire to fuel lines. Children scrawled words on walls. "We are not yours." When the aliens unleashed punishment, it was him they feared most. His fire became a weapon none of them could contain. With her at his side, steadying the storm in his blood, he raised his hands and unleashed waves of searing energy that shattered their steel constructs. Where alien towers once pierced the sky, black smoke rose in their place. And she was no less powerful, not with fire, but with words. She stood atop rubble, chains wrapped around her wrists, and spoke not as governor, not as mistress, but as woman who had once been chained herself. "They crowned me so I would break you," she told the colonists, her voice carrying through stolen transmitters. "They gave me power so you would forget yours. But I was only ever another prisoner. My freedom lies with you, and with him." Her hand found his, their fingers locking, and cameras hidden by rebels caught the moment. The governor who had ruled at the alien's command, now standing with the slave she once owned, looking not like master in possession, but like equals, lovers, allies, fire-bound together. That image spread faster than any command the aliens could give. Broadcasts lit across the colony's stolen networks, showing their faces side by side. The defiance of his burning eyes, the raw humanity in her voice. It was not chains or crowns that drew the people now. It was devotion. They fought because these two had fought for each other. The aliens grew desperate. More troops poured into the colony, their ships blotting out the stars, their commanders vowing to stamp out the uprising before it spread to other worlds. But already it was too late. Entire districts rose up in coordinated strikes. Fuel depots burned, slave quarters became armories, and alien patrols found themselves ambushed at every turn. The rebellion was not organized in any command chain. It was organized by fire and love. One night, standing before the smoldering wreckage of a toppled tower, he turned to her. His skin glowed faintly in the dark, veins of light tracing through him like lightning caged beneath flesh. "They'll never forgive you," he said quietly. "Not them. Not even your own people." Her lips curved into something soft, almost sad. "I don't want forgiveness." She lifted his hand to her chest, pressing it over her heartbeat. "I want you. If I have you, I have everything they could never give me." For a moment, the battlefield fell away. The smoke, the ruin, the cries of the uprising. They were just two people clinging to each other in the eye of the storm. When they kissed, it was not gentle but fierce, desperate, the kind of kiss that burns bridges and builds worlds all at once. By the time dawn rose, the colony was unrecognizable. Alien towers were either burning or abandoned. Colonists marched openly with chains raised like banners of victory, and captured broadcasts showed the aliens retreating, their order crumbling. At the center of it all were the two who had begun as master and slave, but had become something else entirely. Symbols, legends. And yet, as they stood together watching the people tear down the last alien banners, they did not see themselves as legends. He saw her, the woman who had once chained him, now holding those same chains in her hands as weapons against the Empire. She saw him, the man who had once been forced to kneel, now standing taller than any crown could reach. "Do you see what we've done?" she whispered, awed and shaken. He looked out at the fires, at the rising banners, at the storm they had unleashed. Then he looked back at her. "No," he said softly. "Do you see what you have done?" But she shook her head, tears glinting in the firelight. "What we have done. Together. Chains had once bound them. Now they fluttered in the wind, banners of defiance, carrying their story into every corner of the colony. And the aliens, for the first time, were afraid, not of fire, not of rebellion, but of love." The colony was no longer silent. Where once alien banners had hung heavy across broken streets, their now fluttered chains turned into symbols of defiance. Where the towers of surveillance had once stood, blackened stumps smoked against the dawn sky. The air smelled of ash, freedom, and something else, possibility. Humanity had risen, and for the first time in generations, they had won. The people cheered, their voices carrying through the ruins like thunder. Yet in the heart of the crowd, amidst the chants of rebellion and the echo of freedom songs, she slipped away. Her torn governor's cloak dragged across the ground, a symbol of what she once was, of the crown that had been nothing more than another chain. She had worn power like armor, but now, stripped of it, she felt both naked and free. He stood in the ruins of a shattered alien transport, the fire in his veins dimming as if the war itself had fed it. The glow beneath his skin pulsed with each heartbeat, no longer wild, no longer threatening to consume him. She had steadied that fire. She had anchored it. She had anchored him. And yet, as she approached, she felt something heavier than chains in her chest. Fear. She stopped a few paces before him, the crowd's celebration a distant roar behind her. For a moment, she could not speak. Her knees trembled, not from weakness, but from a weight she had carried for too long. Slowly, deliberately, she sank down before him. Not as a governor kneeling to an emperor, not as a servant kneeling to a master, but as a woman, stripped bare of every mask, every crown, every command. Her voice shook, soft enough that only he could hear. "I made you kneel once. I forced you to bow when all you wanted was to stand. I called it power. I told myself it was survival. But it was a lie. All of it. I was never free. I was theirs as much as you were." Her head bowed, her hands trembling as she placed them on the ground before him. "I don't want forgiveness. I don't deserve it. Well, I want what I beg for." She swallowed hard, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I beg for your love." The words hung between them, fragile and burning at once. The fire in his veins pulsed brighter, echoing the storm of emotion inside him. He remembered the shackles biting into his wrists, the humiliation of being forced to crawl at her feet, the anger, the shame. But he also remembered her eyes the night she reached for him not as a master, but as a woman. He remembered her hands steadying his when the fire nearly tore him apart. He remembered the moment she stood against the aliens, casting aside her crown for him, for them. And he knew she was no longer the woman who held chains. She was the woman who had asked him to break them. He reached down, his hand rough, scarred, still faintly glowing, and lifted her chin. Her eyes met his, wide and wet with tears. For a moment, she flinched, afraid of rejection, of the fire in his gaze. But then his other hand came down, pulling her up from the ground. He did not let her kneel. He would never let her kneel again. "I don't want your crown," he said softly, his voice raw. "I don't want your chains. I only ever wanted you." Her breath caught, And for the first time in years, she felt the crown's weight finally leave her shoulders. She was just a woman, standing before the man she loved, and that was enough. She pressed her forehead to his, her lips trembling against his as she whispered, "Then you have me. Always." Their kiss was not like the desperate ones stolen in shadows, not like the furious ones on the edge of battle. It was slower, deeper, steadier. Two souls no longer hiding, no longer pretending. Around them, the rebellion's fire still roared, but in that kiss, they found a quietness stronger than any victory. When they finally pulled apart, the people had seen. A hush rippled through the crowd, then rose into a roar louder than before. They did not see a master and a slave. They did not see a governor and her servant. They saw two lovers bound not by chains but by choice, by fire, by love. Stories spread like lightning. Across the colony, across every hidden broadcast, their image was carried. The woman once crowned, kneeling only to love. The man once enslaved, lifting her up as equal, as partner, as flame. They were remembered not as ruler and servant, but as the fire that broke the chains of an empire. In the quiet that followed, as the sun climbed higher and the alien wreckage cooled to ash, they stood together, hand in hand. The people saw legends, but they only saw each other. "You know what they'll call us now," she said softly, a faint smile trembling on her lips. He raised a brow, amused. "What? Symbols. Gods. The fire that saved them all." She shook her head, leaning closer. "But all I want to be is yours." "And all I want," he murmured, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her close, "is you." The crowd's cheers rose, but for them, the world had already narrowed to one truth. Love had undone chains. Love had burned crowns. Love had turned slavery into legend. And in that love, they were finally free.